6ABC Philadelphia, WABC TV New York, and the League of Women Voters of New Jersey. And now, from our 6ABC Trenton studio, in alphabetical order, the candidates are Republican Jeffrey Bell of Leonia and Democrat Cory Booker of Newark. Our panelists are Matt Friedman for the Star-Ledger, Mariela Salgado for WXTV Noticias 41, and Jonathan Tamari for the Philadelphia Inquirer. Moderating the debate are WABC TV's anchor Sade Bedouinois and Jim Gardner of 6ABC.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for this debate between the two candidates running for the U.S. Senate in New Jersey.
They have gathered here for what we hope will be a wide-ranging and informative discussion of the major issues in the campaign. And a quick note about the format. Each candidate will have 1 minute to answer the question posed to them by Jim, myself, and our three panelists. The candidates have also agreed to one round in which they will ask each other one question. At the end of the debate, each candidate will have 1 minute to make a closing statement.
And so let's begin by random drawing. Our first question goes to Mr. Bell. Mr. Bell, only 5 people have been diagnosed with the Ebola virus in the United States, and each one has a direct connection, an obvious connection, a first-generational connection with the source of contagion. Are we making too much of this? Are we overreacting to Ebola? And by that I mean the government, the media, the medical community, and subsequently Americans? Or is this an ominous public health issue? And if so, what would be the first priority of the federal government?
In my opinion, Jim, the government has underreacted. We have underestimated the ease with which this thing spreads when it gets around into a given country. We should have cut off, on a temporary basis, all flights from the 3 West African countries involved. And I think President Obama has once again failed and helped an institution, namely the CDC, to fail by political appointments and complacency. We absolutely have to have a temporary travel ban. Screening people in the airports isn't enough because very often the symptoms are delayed. And I don't think just saying that the experts think that it won't help is enough. I think we have to err on the side of caution and aggressive containment of this disease.
Mr. Booker.
First of all, I want to thank the sponsors of this event. I want to thank the moderators, thank my opponent, as well as the viewers at home. This is a clear difference for New Jersey voters in the choices you have in this election. Between someone already who's obviously about a Tea Party, attacking, hardening positions, as opposed to somebody in the state of a crisis that really reaches out and finds ways to work together. Look, I'm the senator right now, and the biggest call to my office is from New Jerseyans worried and concerned about this issue. And so as a result of that, what I've done first and foremost is make sure that after Tea Party and others look to cut organizations like the CDC, that they had their funding, and join with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to get them $88 million more. On top of that, I say we have to hold the people accountable. And I've been talking directly to heads of CDC, Health and Human Services, even going out to Newark Airport to make sure all the policies and procedures are there, and working with the Christie administration to make sure our hospitals are prepared. I will make sure I hold everyone accountable for keeping us safe.
And the next question goes to Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker, the shooting at the Canadian Parliament complex in Ottawa certainly heightened fears about a homegrown lone wolf terror attack. It's believed the gunman was sympathetic to ISIS, and given that New York and New Jersey are really considered the leading targets for a terrorist attack, how would you make sure that there are adequate resources given to the state to combat terrorism?
Well, first and foremost, the number one time, the only time as a mayor I was invited to the Situation Room in the White House was to work on the challenge of homegrown terrorism. And we need to make sure that our agencies that are in charge of protecting us have the resources necessary to do the job, and we're being very aggressive about that. That's why I've supported investing, especially in New York and New Jersey, which have been targets in the past, making sure that our local law enforcement officials, our state officials, have actually the resources they need and the kind of coordination to stop these attacks. But I want to tell you, I have a worry. I worry right now that while in states like New Jersey, we have good laws in place to try to keep guns out of the hands of criminals, we still live in a nation where someone who's on a terrorist no-fly list that we worry about committing terrorist acts can go down to Virginia, where my opponent has lived for the last 30 years, and go to a gun show and just buy a weapon without background checks. We need to tighten up common sense gun regulations to keep weapons, guns, out of the hands of criminals and terrorists. We should change these laws as soon as possible.
Mr. Bell, your response.
I am astounded that anyone would turn the situation in Canada into a sermonette on gun control. This is a worldwide problem. It is not just a matter of an individual criminal or terrorist. President Obama is very reluctant to call things like this acts of terrorism, and that is part of the problem. We have to be honest about what the nature of the problem is and the extent of it. And we have to take greater measures to prevent this from happening, to screen more people as they're coming into the country. But more important, it's a worldwide war. And to say that it isn't a war, as President Obama insists on doing, whether it's the domestic war or what is happening with Islamic State, is it's just unconscionable. We have to be truthful about the nature of the problem and much more active, both overseas and here. It's better to do it overseas before it gets here.
And a quick follow for you, Mr. Booker. Do you support putting American troops on the ground to fight ISIS? And if so, would it be for a limited time period or would this be open-ended?
Well, first and foremost, ISIS is a real threat. They've been cutting swaths through the Middle East, putting in danger ethnic minorities, beheading citizens, doing harsh and horrendous things to women, and they must be stopped. But at the end of the day, I disagree with the president that he should have come to Congress actually to have an open debate about our commitments to this crisis. I'm a big believer that they must be stopped. But before we rush off to war, let's make sure, because we've learned the hard lessons in the past, let's make sure we have an open debate. We have clear objectives. We have contingency plans, because we've seen what happens and how things can go wrong in the past. And let's make sure that we have all the resources we need to do the job and that our allies are footing some of the bill and bearing some of the burden. America can't just rush off into this. We need to have an open discussion and debate about what the strategy and tactics are and make sure we're doing this in coordination with our allies and make sure we have a real plan to stop this ISIS threat.
Mr. Bell, your response.
Again, I'm astounded that you would say that the priority is to get the allies to spend money on this. There are no allies who can take the leadership. America has the only 21st century military in the West. And to say that we have to wait for allies to spend money, we have to have a debate in Congress concerning that a declaration of war exists. That is what we need to do. We have to have a debate about the strategic objective, not the ways and means, not the type of bombing, not whether troops are ever deployed. Some of them already are, but that's irrelevant to the issue of what is our strategic objective. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a great war president because he knew in the situation we were in World War II, the only policy toward the Nazis and the Japanese Empire was unconditional surrender. Our debate should be, we have to destroy ISIS. We have to annihilate them before they annihilate us, which they have consistently threatened to do in beheading our captives.
Our next question comes from Mariela Salgado, and it goes to Mr. Bell.
Mr. Bell, more than 30,000 unaccompanied minors have traveled into the United States illegally from Central America. They claim they're escaping from poverty and from violence. And they are in New Jersey. They are in the state. In fact, more than 1,500 to be exact are living right now in New Jersey. Would you support any sort of plan that integrates them in our society, in our schools, since their families have been here already, some of them for many years, or any plan that will give them some sort of temporary or special status for these families and these children?
We have to be compassionate, Mariela, toward those who have been sent across the border by parents who are desperate, either unaccompanied they came or accompanied by coyotes. But I think it also illustrates the failure of the Obama administration on the issue of immigration in general. When the DREAM Act failed to pass, President Obama went out and gave an amnesty to young people who had come here with their parents, not of their own accord. And it seemed like an unexceptionable thing to do in some ways, but here 2 years later we have a national embarrassment and humiliation with this system of, this non-system we have causing this flight from the south toward our borders. We have to do everything to change the immigration system, to replace the mess we have now with a legal immigration system that includes both a path to citizenship for those here illegally and also a guest worker program for those who want to work here temporarily. President Obama pays lip service to this, but he did nothing when he had the majority of votes for immigration in his first 2 years in office.
So the state of New Jersey shouldn't wait anymore then and should grant some sort of special status to these families? Is that what you're saying, Mr. Bell?
I believe we need to help them. Whether you need to legislate a special status or not, I'm agnostic about that, but certainly we can't act as if they are criminals.
Mr. Booker.
Thank you very much. I support the comprehensive bipartisan immigration reform that we've seen going on and actually passed through the Senate. And it involved people from both sides working together that would have helped so many children in New Jersey. I support the Dreamers Act that, again, has some bipartisan support that can give those kids who know no other country but the United States, who've learned from our schools, the ability to stay here and contribute to our great economy and our great country. What's really remarkable to me is that my Tea Party-backed friend already in this little small debate, just a handful of questions, has shown the kind of attack, slam, and slander he is. He says he believes in Tea Party militancy. Has already mentioned the president attacked him, I'm counting now, about 7 times already. That's not what's going to bring us together in Washington and move us forward. We need people that don't believe in Tea Party militancy, but they're going to come together with people on both sides of the aisle and solve difficult problems like immigration. There's a comprehensive movement going bipartisan, not like my opponent who wants to retrench and actually wrote a book called The Case for a Polarized Politics. We don't need more of what's making Washington bad. We need people that are going to bring folks together and move our country forward.
I'd like to answer that because apparently the senator is unaware that I have worked for 10 years for bipartisan comprehensive immigration reform, even working for a Latino civil rights organization, La Raza. La Raza president, Janet Murguia, recently called President Obama the deporter-in-chief. He is a complete phony in saying that he wants immigration reform, and Senator Booker utters not a word of criticism to this complete abdication and failure on his part. I have a track record on working for a bipartisan immigration bill. I was filmed in the office of Senator Ted Kennedy in 2007 working on that. It's really silly to say that I am a phony on that.
Mr. Booker.
Sir, I had the privilege of meeting Ted Kennedy. There's no two further apart politicians in America than Ted Kennedy and my opponent. And I have a simple belief. If someone tells you who they are, believe them. And if they look like a duck and quack like a duck, then believe they're a duck. This is a guy who is supported by the Tea Party. This is a man who actually wrote a book called The Case for Polarized Politics. If we send him down to Washington, he's not going to be involved in bipartisan coalitions. He himself has told us, I believe in Tea Party militancy. That means digging in, don't compromise the kind of shutdown government problems that we've had. America's had enough of that. It's time for people to come together and work on solutions to our problems.
I thought the whole point of working with people who are different ideologically is to bring them together on things they can agree on, but I guess Senator Booker has a different definition of bipartisanship.
And gentlemen, we're going to have to move on. The next question comes from Matt Friedman and goes to Mr. Booker. Matt?
Senator, just a good segue into this, because with the congressional inaction on immigration, President Obama had planned to issue a major executive order to overhaul the system as much as he could by the end of the summer. But amid pleas from Democrats who are locked in tough races this year, they feared voter backlash, and President Obama delayed action until after the midterm elections. Do you agree with President Obama's decision to delay action on that executive order?
Absolutely not. The president was wrong. The president should have stood up and made the call to do whatever he could to advance what's right for America. You know, I've spent the last years traveling all around my state while my opponent was working in a think tank in Washington for the last 30 years. And when I talk to people, both business folks as well as people in the community, they understand that we have a problem. Whether it's people who come to our schools and graduate from our universities, as soon as their student visa's up, we're kicking them out when they want to contribute to our economy. Or young kids who are being denied access to citizenship even though they've spent pretty much their entire lives here. We have an urgent immigration issue. There should be no waiting for politics. I didn't support the president's decision, and I will continue to go to Washington to work to bring people together to make sure that we, in a unified way, solve this problem.
Senator, no one is going to come together if the president threatens unilateral executive action. It's just not going to happen. You pay lip service to bipartisanship, but you've just advocated something that would completely foul the immigration debate. having the president do everything by executive action, which he's not constitutionally entitled to do, which would drive Republicans and everyone else in Congress away from the table. You talk a good game on bipartisanship, but that answer shows that you really don't mean it.
May I respond to that, please? This is the typical Tea Party cry. They attack Obama, attack Obama, attack Obama, call him King Obama for all the executive orders that he's done. Well, if you actually look at the numbers, President Obama is doing less executive orders than other presidents, from Jimmy Carter to Ronald Reagan to even George Bush. Again, this is exemplary of what he does. He is part of a movement that is going to be slamming and slandering and not stopping that madness and finding ways to bring people together, to work together, to find solutions. We've had enough of that in Washington. His book tells you that. The title of it is The Case for Polarized Politics. We don't need more gridlock in Washington. We need to work together and solve our problems.
Polarization is sometimes a public service because it enables voters to see the difference between 2 points of view. That's the sense in which I think polarization is sometimes good.
Let's go on to Jonathan Tamari for Mr. Bell.
Governor Christie said this week that he's tired of hearing about the minimum wage, and he later said the focus should be on creating better and higher paying jobs. Democrats have been saying they want to give a raise to 3.3 million people who earn the minimum wage or less. The federal minimum wage has been $7.25 an hour since 2009. Should it be increased?
It's a bad time to do that because the openings are so limited. The young people here, particularly high school graduates, will be priced out of that market. Just the other day I read about McDonald's, which is having a significant decline in profitability because of the prospective minimum wage increase is going to go to technology to replace low-wage workers. That's counterproductive in a very, very difficult job market.
Mr. Booker?
My opponent says it's a bad time to do what's right. I've talked to people in our state and I've heard from them. Heard from a guy who lost his job, had a good minimum wage job, lost his job, and now is working, had a good job, now lost his job, is working a minimum wage job, trying to support his family. It's a good time for him to raise the minimum wage now. Talk to people at Essex County College who are trying to go to school, work a full-time job, making the minimum wage, and they can barely afford to make ends meet because they work a full-time job and are still under the poverty line. It's a good time to do it for that person. And what about that single mom who's working double shifts because in New Jersey, when you work a full-time job at the minimum wage, it in no way is enough to meet the minimum basic needs of her family. It is a good time to raise the minimum wage. We are America. Nobody should work full-time and find themselves under the poverty line, having to go to food banks and rely on public assistance just to make ends meet. It is a good time to do the right thing. In fact, it always is.
That is typical of why we have a jobless recovery. The minimum wage, even if you like it, is redistribution. It takes money from one sector and gives it to another. It has nothing whatsoever to do with fixing the economy and creating new jobs.
Mr. Booker, let's look at some statistics as long as we're talking about jobs. The jobless rate in New Jersey is 6.5%, which is 0.6% higher than the national average. But Newark's jobless rate is 11.3%, Camden's is 14.3%, and I think most experts, and you probably would agree, to say that the jobless rates are really much higher than that because of all the people who have stopped looking for work. Economic recovery or not, jobs tops the list of most voters' list of concerns. What kind of program would you support, or for that matter, create to bring jobs to New Jersey?
Well, it's not what I would do. It's what I've been doing for the last 11 months, is working hard on that fundamental idea, is how do we get people back to work in New Jersey? That's why I fought to support our community colleges with programs now bringing back millions of dollars to link them actually to industry and to jobs that exist. When I go around and talk to manufacturers and other businesses here, one of the biggest things they tell me is, hey, we don't have links to qualified leadership. We need everything from machinists to other technical positions. And so bringing back resources to train our workers for today's jobs is so important. I've talked to businesses that say the biggest inhibitor to growth for them often is access to capital or making that happen. I've talked to some of our major industries, and they say one of the biggest problems we have is a tax rate that's not low and fair and puts them on competitive footing. And I've been working with others across the aisle to lower our corporate tax rate. And finally, we've been doing everything possible to make sure that we have a fair economic policy in this state. That means that a woman that works a full-time job, does the same job as a man, should get the same pay. These are things that actually would help drive our economy, because when consumers have resources, we can grow our demand and grow our middle class grow our economy from the middle class out.
Mr. Bell?
Everything that was just mentioned involves an expansion of government programs. Some of them may be good programs, but we've had 6 years of trying to stimulate the economy from 2008 to 2014 by increased spending, printing more money. The economy hasn't been stimulated. We don't have as many full-time jobs today as we had at the end of the recession. There are a few more part-time jobs. This is not growth. This is not stimulus. It has failed, and he agrees with President Obama's approach. Spend more government money and print more money to fund that spending. And it hasn't worked. And if you want to try something different, then you're going to have to vote for me.
Well, are you saying that we are not in the midst of an economic recovery?
It's a jobless recovery. The GDP has gone up a little bit, but it actually is the weakest economic recovery in American history. And the reason is that small business hasn't been able to expand because of the Federal Reserve's zero interest rate policy, which is going on for 6 years and which President Obama wants to continue indefinitely along with the Fed chairman. That is the single biggest reason why small business can't expand. The banks, the little banks that normally lend to them, are on the sidelines because they can't make any money even with a good loan.
And my next question is for Mr. Bell, and piggybacking on Jim's question about jobs, I want to turn our attention now to Atlantic City. We know that a third of the casinos there have closed. Many of them are nearly bankrupt. Nearly 8,000 jobs have been lost. What will you do to create more jobs in southern New Jersey and to make sure Atlantic City thrives once again?
Well, the first thing we have to do is stop the hemorrhaging, and I am totally opposed to the idea of having a casino in northern New Jersey. Having another casino or a set of casinos will solve no problems, and it will make everything in Atlantic City worse. We need to have Atlantic City remain, at least for the state of New Jersey, a destination. That's why I don't favor sports gambling on the internet. If we're going to have sports gambling, if it's upheld in the courts, it should be only in Atlantic City and perhaps a few racetracks. We have to stop the hemorrhaging. I was in Atlantic City 2 days ago at a forum that Senator Booker chose not to attend. And the whole idea of starting businesses and diversifying, there's a cup put on top of that, a cap that says you can't start a business without enormous problems of regulation, taxation, permits, and you can't get the bank loans, the lines of credit needed, especially for a new business. That's the first thing we have to solve. Atlantic City and the rest of New Jersey are suffering heavily from a national problem.
Mr. Booker, what will you do to create more jobs?
Thank you, and I disagree with my opponents. The first thing we need to do is stop the hemorrhaging by opposing a casino in the north that is nowhere near even past discussion stages. The first thing we need to do is help the people of Atlantic City. That's why months and months ago, before the casino closes, I sat down with the Republican mayor of that town, brought in the Federal Department of Labor and others to say, hey, if the casinos should close, let's be proactive and make sure that we get grants to help those folks to bridge in training to other jobs. Let's make sure we help our veterans that are involved in some of these layoffs to get those special programs that veterans can get. You see, my opponent says he opposes federal government intervention. Well, if that's the case, why is he going to Washington? I'm going to Washington to bring back resources to help people like the folks in Atlantic City. And I believe that some of the things that can help them actually are us investing in infrastructure again. That's why I support improvements to the Atlantic City Airport that will bring people there and make it more easy for people to travel. I've worked with Republican Governor Christie on this, as well as the airlines. I believe in doing things for South Jersey like expanding PATCO, a light rail that will bring lots of business and economic growth. It's smart, strategic solutions that always begin with, first and foremost, having a senator that's going to be there for people in trouble.
It may be in the discussion phase and only in the discussion phase, but will you support a casino in North Jersey?
Under no condition will I support a casino in northern New Jersey if it's going to undermine or hurt Atlantic City.
Well, that's a subjective, judgment.
And the reason why I say it's not a judgment is because there are some people that are saying that Atlantic City could share in some of that revenue. So before I make a universal declaration against something, the key thing here is to help Atlantic City. That city is a great New Jersey city.
I have to ask you one more time.
Yes.
Will you support a casino in North Jersey?
I will
Yes or
not
no?
support a casino in northern New Jersey if it hurts Atlantic City, period.
Do you support legalizing sports gambling in New Jersey?
I think I'm with the governor on this. Right now, it helps to bring revenue in the state. This is illegal activities that have been going on for a long time. Let's regulate it, tax it, and get the benefit here in New Jersey.
Mariela Delgado, a question for Mr. Booker.
Mr. Bell, going back to immigration, New York City recently adopted a municipal ID card for undocumented residents to bring them out of the shadows so they could have a better relationship with police, and they get some small benefits from the city. Would you support a single federal ID card system for undocumented families?
I do not like the idea of a universal ID card. The Social Security card is close to being that, but I think it's making a big mistake to go in that direction, especially with the surveillance issues that we've had during the Obama administration and earlier. I do think that that is an illustration of why we need to attack the whole problem at once. Comprehensive immigration reform that erects a legal system to replace the illegal system and the mess that we have now is the only way. Those little steps, like New York City, I wouldn't necessarily repeal it, but it isn't the answer. The answer has to be negotiation between Republicans and Democrats and a serious effort to achieve comprehensive immigration reform in the next Congress.
Mr. Booker?
Right now, we've driven undocumented immigrants into the shadows, and it hurts actually American citizens. I've talked to mayors from Patterson to Camden that have stories about immigrants being victimized by crime because criminals think, hey, let's prey on those people because they're not going to go to the police and report it. We need to have a system that brings folks out of the shadows, that we know who they are and can work with them on a pathway to citizenship. Right now, the system we have is unacceptable, and so we need a comprehensive plan to do that. And in order to do that, that plan is going to have to come from Washington, D.C., and voters are going to have to make a choice. Who can best actually get into the trenches and negotiate and bring people together to bring about that kind of solution? The Tea Party has proven time and time again that they are a block towards broad-based coalitions for change. My Tea Party candidate would make what's wrong with Washington worse. I'm going down there to work with my colleagues to find a real solution that can empower.
I thought all we needed was an executive order,
Sir, you don't have to interrupt me when I'm talking. We need to make sure that we have civility back in Washington, not the kind of aggressive Tea Party attacks that we're seeing from my opponent.
Would you support giving them driver license like other states have?
I would support first and foremost finding a comprehensive system to doing this reform. And I think that we're on the verge of doing that if we can get the Tea Party in the House to step down.
The executive order is what he said is his solution. Yes, it is a solution that comes out of Washington, but it's something that will completely foul the mood for getting this program, this problem out of the way with a comprehensive solution. I'm the negotiator. I worked with liberal Democrats to try to achieve immigration reform in the Bush years. We failed, but it was a major good faith effort. He agrees with President Obama that no negotiations are needed, just issue an executive order. That's not my idea of bipartisanship.
Well,
Let's move on. Let's move on.
We have the next question that comes from Matt Friedman, and it is for Mr. Bell.
Mr. Bell, you've spoken out against gay marriage. We've had it for a year now, legal in New Jersey, and it's about to be legal, or is legal, in the majority of states now. Do you believe that any harm has come from this? And even though you do support a federal amendment to define marriage as between a man and a woman, do you think that gay marriage's expansion and maybe even universality in this country is inevitable given the way that political winds are blowing?
I don't think anything is inevitable in a democracy. You have to have a debate. New Jersey denied that debate because Supreme Court judges said this is a civil right. The founders wrote it into the Constitution in 1789. That's a ridiculous thing to say. But even aside from that, I think if you're going to have social change, it's much better to debate it out, have an honest debate, and have a vote on it, which Governor Christie favored, but he was overruled. Every new gay marriage state has been imposed by either state or federal judges. I think that is one of the most unhealthy things I can imagine, and it sets up a repeat of Roe v. Wade, which expanded the abortion issue, prolonged it for over 40 years. It's a terrible idea, and I think I've been very honest, as you know, Matt, in saying that I believe it's a self-evident truth that marriage includes a husband and a wife, and that's my position. But even worse is the idea of imposing this by unelected judges.
But do you believe any harm has come out of it now that we've had at least a year here in New Jersey?
I think taking the word husband out of the legal definition of marriage is a terrible mistake. especially at a time when we know that intact families, a mother, father, and kids, that is the greatest income program there is, and it's the greatest anti-welfare program there is. It works. And taking the word husband out is going to just increase the breakup of the traditional family.
My opponent clearly has different views, not only than me, but than the majority of New Jerseyans. He wants to take us backwards to a time before Roe v. Wade and take away a woman's right to make her own medical decisions. He wants to take away the right for two people who love each other to get married and to be together. I'm telling you right now, I would not be here right now if the rights of African Americans back in the 1960s were put up to votes for what's best or what's right. Fundamental rights are just that. We have a Constitution, 14th Amendment, that says equal protection under the law. You can't have a law that discriminates against one group in favor of another or discriminates against anyone. We are a nation that is going to get so much further if we understand that we all are equal under the law and need each other to be successful. I'm not going to go to Washington or stand here in New Jersey and demean any group and deny them basic rights. We should let people who love each other have the right to get married.
Next question comes from Jonathan Tamari for Mr. Booker.
Mr. Booker, the Department of Justice has named 55 colleges under investigation for the way they've handled sexual assault complaints. That includes in New Jersey, Princeton University. Some of the stories have been shocking that have come out. But is this an area that Congress can influence and should influence, and how? Or is this best left to the institutions?
Well, obviously, if we have a problem like we have right now in the nation, colleges and institutions are not doing enough. And I'm tired in this country of us not taking sexual assault and domestic violence as seriously as we should. Congress has an obligation to make sure we are seeing fairness and justice play out. And in this case, it's not. As you said yourself, these stories are egregious. And so I, for one, have joined with other of my colleagues, many of whom are on both sides of the aisle, in saying that we must do something about this. And so I'm going to fight against domestic violence. I'm going to fight against sexual assault. And I'm going to find concrete ways to do it. And one example of that is we have a system right now that while the NBA and and Major League Baseball don't have tax-exempt status, a lot of other sports leagues do, like the NFL, golf, and others. I want to eliminate that tax-exempt status and take that savings and invest it in the kind of programs that protect and affirm women's rights, like domestic violence prevention.
This is the Obama-Booker vision, which is, if anything needs doing, it must be done in Washington. And after the last couple of years, when we've had the IRS, the CDC, the Secret Service letting people into the White House and the director having to resign, all of these institutions failing under President Obama, whom Senator Booker supports in almost every area, and he thinks that even something as obscure as rules in the local colleges will be better handled by Washington. Of course there's a problem, Senator, but don't you think that just once in a while you should let normal people in local government work it out to the best of their ability? They have a better track record than Washington.
May I answer that question?
You can respond.
Look, when New Jersey residents come to me with a crisis or a problem, I want to find a way to do something about that. Doesn't always mean legislative actions or things like that, but it means having a senator be there to stand up for people. College campuses have not been dealing with this problem. And so it really hurts me to think that there will be potentially a senator going down to Washington with extreme views on women and on gays and others, that when folks come to him for help, to get him involved, even if it's just picking up a phone and letting the presidents of college know that this is wrong and that we will be watching. I will be one of those United States senators that when New Jerseyans come to me with a problem, sexual assault, domestic violence, I will stand up and be there for them.
Okay. Well, as we mentioned earlier, the candidates have agreed to one round in which they ask each other a question. And we're going to start with Mr. Booker's question to Mr. Bell.
Well, I want to stick with that subject that we keep coming back to. You've consistently shown that you want to deny women their freedoms and rights to make their own health care decisions. Even in the most extreme cases, if somebody is raped or a victim of incest. I want to know and understand, why don't you trust women in those extreme cases when they're victims of such violence and rape to make their own decisions? Why do you believe that men like you should tell women what they can do with their bodies?
Certainly women have bodies, and I respect that. They need to take care of them and have the right to preserve their bodies. But unborn babies have a body too, Senator. They have a full complement of DNA, the human genome, things that we found out since 1973. Cory Booker was once a one-celled zygote, and normally a one-celled zygote grows up to be a human being, maybe even a U.S. Senator, which I give you credit for. But I would have a hard time looking a woman in the face and saying, even though you became pregnant through a rape, you should carry your child to term because it has a body, it has its own life. But I would find it even harder to go to the most recent Miss Pennsylvania, who has worked for rape victims, but who herself was the product of a rape, and tell her, you don't deserve to live.
All right. Now, Mr. Bell, you have a question for Mr. Booker.
Senator, the watershed authorities' problems during your administration have been coming up a little more frequently lately. And I'd just like to ask you a simple question to clear things up, which is, on Channel 5 in New York last week, you said, this week actually on Wednesday, you said that the $700,000 in 6 individual payments, 689 to be exact, came as a result of you took your ownership with you and it was a buyout and they didn't have the money all at once. I ask you, is there a document in writing that specifies what that arrangement is?
So my opponent spent a lot of time down in Virginia the last 30 years and hasn't been paying attention much. So I appreciate him trying to pay catch up right now, but he's a big supporter of businesses. And so when I was a private citizen, I helped to grow and make a functioning business that actually had a lot of value in it. And so when I was going to run for mayor, I decided that I would step down from that business and take my ownership stake. And I agreed with my partners that my ownership stake would be valued at a certain amount. And when I left, that I would be entitled for that lump sum. Well, the law firm did not have that lump sum to give to me at one time. And so they agreed to pay it out over a course of time. And yes, that agreement was done verbally as well as a document.
Could you provide it to the public?
That document contains private financial information of my partners, and it's not necessary.
So your reason is that you don't think the voters of New Jersey have any right to see a document that gave you $700,000 in annual payments over 6 years. Is there some kind of privilege that you have that the voters do not share?
No, I think the privilege that I have, first of all, is for you not to misconstrue the fact. $700,000 in annual payments is not what happened. I had a determined amount in which I made clear through my tax records and showed the public what I did. And so what I simply say right now is, if we're looking at levels of transparency of the two men standing here, nobody's giving it. I've exposed 16 years of my tax returns. I've let people see my private financial documents. I'm not going to subject people to my law firm from that, but you haven't even matched my level of transparency with your own financial records, and I invite you to do the same thing.
My tax returns are online. Yours are not, none of them.
3 years of your tax returns, sir. 3 years. Go back 10 years or 15 years.
Why in your most recent tax return do you only let people see the first 2 pages where you can't see the sources of your income?
Sir, again, we set a level of transparency that has not been met by any candidate running for Senate for the last 30 years since you've been out of Washington. Meet that level of transparency yourself. Meet the same level of transparency for the voter.
Okay, we've got a lot of ground to cover, so let's move on.
Yes. Mr. Bell, some disturbing statistics from the Vera Institute of Justice. You may be familiar with them. The United States represents 4% of the world population. It has 25% of the world's prison population. The United States spends 6 times as much on prisons as it does on education. And in New Jersey, the state spends $18,600 per public school student and $54,800 per inmate. Is this fixable, and if so, how?
Jim, I just am not an advocate of using dollar amounts to say how well a given problem is going. This country did have a big success story, which is the crime explosion that we had in the 60s and 70s was checked. Yes, an overuse of prison might have been part of that, but I think we have to be very careful about letting people who were accused of violent crimes out. They may have pled to a nonviolent crime. Most prosecutors don't go to court to get these convictions, but I would be very reluctant to see a drug dealer or somebody who pled to a lesser charge, even though what he was accused of originally was a violent crime, get out scot-free.
Mr. Booker?
I'm sorry, this is a utterly broken system. Think about that. We are only 4% of the globe's population, but we have 25% of the globe's imprisoned people. And I believe, like my opponent, violent people should be behind bars. But please understand, over 70% of those people are non-violent offenders. This is an incredible failed drug war. The over-criminalization. In fact, it's so bad that only, if you go to jail drug addicted, only about 20% of those people with drug or alcohol addictions actually get help. So what happens when they get released? They end up coming right back. There are common sense solutions that could relieve taxpayers of the extraordinary burden. We're spending $250 billion a year running a broken system. Money that should go to our schools, should be invested in our infrastructure. And so common sense reform. And that's why when I went to Washington, I went to solve this problem by working across the aisle with Rand Paul and others to design legislation that's agreed on in a bipartisan fashion to reduce our prison population, make our streets safer, and better invest taxpayer dollars. Or hey, guess what? Or return it to taxpayers, because all of us spend annually hundreds of dollars to support a broken system.
What are the common sense solutions?
The common sense solutions involve giving drug treatment to people that actually have addictions, helping them when they come out to get connections to work. Right now we have a system that has a recidivism rate our correction system doesn't correct. And so there are states like Mississippi, the red state of Mississippi, which has been dramatically lowering its prison population through common sense solutions, and guess what's happened to their crime? Their crime has gone down. You see, these are the solutions we can do if we work together across the aisle. That's why I put forth a major piece of legislation endorsed by people on the right and the left with Rand Paul to address these issues, save taxpayer dollars, create safer streets, and elevate human potential.
Okay.
Judging from his endorsement by NORML, the pro-legal marijuana group, one of those common sense solutions in his coming term, if he's reelected, is going to be legalization of marijuana.
I would love to talk about that if he's going to throw that out there. May I please talk about this?
Sure.
Oh, go ahead.
So my opponent doesn't even support the common sense thing here in New Jersey of medical marijuana, where we actually have sick people in New Jersey who can't get access to a drug that would help their families and their children. So I do support strongly re-examining pot laws, but not to legalize marijuana, but to do things that will help families in New Jersey that I've talked to that are going through terrible trials because they can't even get medical marijuana. And I'll add to that.
I thought we had it. I thought you said we had it.
I did put in, no, it's being slowed down and slow walked by the administration. But I'll tell you one other piece of legislation.
By Governor Christie?
Yes, sir, by Governor Christie. And I'll tell you another piece of legislation that I put in on marijuana with a Republican, Rand Paul, to say that the federal government in states that do have marijuana laws like Colorado and Washington, that we shouldn't be using our federal dollars to prosecute people that are abiding by the laws of their state. And so this is a chance for us to, in a bipartisan way, to do common sense things, to make our streets safer, save taxpayer dollars, something I thought my opponent would like, and better invest it in things that we need to grow our economy.
Mr. Booker, I'm going to have to cut you off there because we have to move on.
Sure.
And my next question goes to you. I'd like to pivot to the fatal shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, as well as the chokehold death of Eric Garner in Staten Island. And clearly these two cases reignited tensions between police and the minority community and really just exposed deep mistrust with police. There is a recent Gallup poll that shows 64% of blacks had very little or no confidence in police. What can you do to help bridge that divide?
Well, first and foremost, I want to express my sympathies to the families of both of these men that died. Their deaths were tragedies, and I know their families are mourning right now, as many people in those communities. I stand here right now because our country has made a lot of progress on race. People understood that black or white, we don't have different destinies in this country for different groups. We have one common destiny. I believe there are common sense things we could do in criminal justice reform to actually repair that problem. Take marijuana, what we were just talking about. There are no differences in marijuana usage for blacks and whites in this country. The last 3 presidents admitted to smoking marijuana. In fact, well, maybe the exception one did not inhale. But the reality is that blacks are almost 4 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana usage than whites are. These are things we have to have an honest conversation about and work together to correct. We live in a nation that has an interwoven destiny. And as your United States Senator, I'm going to be working on those common sense solutions to get beyond rhetoric to do things to make a fairer criminal justice system.
I have to say that I also mourn for those families, for their losses. And I do think that the police have to do a better job of reaching out to the community in communities where they are not doing that. But I also am worried about the militarization of police departments. If that is the best we can do as a way of preventing or stopping crime, I think we have a problem. I believe that William Bratton, now the police commissioner of New York, revolutionized law enforcement with his community policing idea, being opposed to the broken windows, even though it's a small misdemeanor. It leads to much bigger consequences, a disrespect for the law. And I believe that hands-on policing is the way to go rather than tanks and things like that belonging to police departments.
We're going to tighten this up a little bit, so please, if you'll cooperate with us, we can get a few more questions in. Mariella, for Mr. Bell.
Yes, actually I want to continue on education, if you don't mind, because we're on the topic. New Jersey is one of the worst states when it comes to achievement gap. We're talking about minorities. A recent study showed that nearly 75% of Black and Latino students in New Jersey are not proficient when it comes to math or reading. Is there anything that you plan to do to help these minorities to close this gap?
We have to get education back to the state and local level. Washington got into this in something called the National Defense Education Act in 1957, when we enacted that, the first federal intervention in education, supposedly to stop the missile gap or to have our own Sputnik. It really had nothing to do with that. Washington just needed an excuse, and in the entire period that we've had federal involvement in education, education standards have declined all over the country. Now, there's a Common Core program that is going to try to put everyone into a cookie cutter. It doesn't let teachers teach, it stops spontaneity, and it dumbs down the entire curriculum. Instead of that, and instead of bribe programs, legal bribe programs like Race to the Top, which is, for example, bribe Massachusetts into dropping much higher standards than the Common Core had or will ever have, we need to decentralize spending. We need to get the federal government. Yes, I would abolish the Department of Education. 60 years of a failed experiment is enough. This country developed the first universal education system by means of popular control and experimentation at the state and local level. We need to get back to that vision.
Okay, thank you. And our next question comes from Matt Friedman.
Mr. Booker.
Mr. Booker, you actually want to respond?
I definitely want to respond to that. This is my opponent who wants to take us backwards. I'm looking to go forward. He doesn't think that we should have a Department of Education. The strongest country in the globe should not have a federal Department of Education. And things like the EPA and other things, he wants to unwind investment in our kids, unwind protections for our families. I'm going to Washington not to destroy government. I'm going to Washington to solve the problems that people say we have in our communities. And this means things like investing in universal preschool, because every kid, black or white, sir.
How about the Common Core,
sir?
Are you for or against the Common Core?
Finish my answer. I haven't interrupted you. And if this is your example of civility down in Washington, it's just not going to work. If I can finish my 60 seconds.
Quickly.
We need to have a person down in Washington that's going to fight for our kids and invest in things, especially things like even affordable college. One of the biggest things I hear from folks is the expense of college education. So from universal preschool all the way to getting our kids to college, this is something I'm going to go down to Washington, not to destroy the Department of Education, but to make sure that we are investing in the things that matter to New Jerseyans.
And gentlemen, we are nearing the end of the debate, so if we can keep our responses to about 30 seconds so we can get through a list of other questions. Our next question comes from Matt Friedman for Mr. Booker. Matt?
Senator, you weren't mayor of Newark too long ago, so I'd just like to go back to that time. Federal authorities are investigating Newark's watershed agency, probably for allegedly illegal payments to its former executive director. That happened during your time as mayor and while you were ex officio chairman of this agency. You've said that you tried to eliminate the agency and rein it in, but during this time you did not attend any of its board meetings, so I'm wondering if you feel any responsibility for letting this get out of hand.
Well, the fact of the matter is it was out of hand when I got into office, and I took responsibility right away by trying to get rid of the agency. We tried to get rid of it legislatively, failed through the council. We tried to get rid of it in other ways and kept failing. We knew it was out of control, we knew it had problems, and we wanted to correct them. And the malfeasance that you're talking about, we discovered it before it was the public or your papers were writing about it, and we turned it over to the authorities and said they should investigate this individual actor, and if they've done done something wrong, they should be held accountable. And so I will continue to work aggressively, whether it's as I did when I was mayor or and now as the United States Senator, to root out the problems and try to solve them like I did.
Mr. Bell.
How long did you know about the scandal before you disclosed it to the public?
May I answer that question? I knew about it for probably moments. As soon as we discovered it, we turned it right over. Moments. So.
Okay.
All right, our next question comes from Jonathan Tamari for Mr. Bell.
We talked earlier in this debate about gun laws. You have talked about your support for the Second Amendment. Last year, the Senate could not pass bills to expand background checks or tighten other gun laws. There was opposition from Republicans and Democrats both. If these bills cannot pass, and if you oppose them, what other steps can be taken to address gun violence?
I think it should be addressed primarily with increased penalties for those who use firearms in the commission of a crime. I think that's been a much more successful approach. As to the gun show amendment that was defeated, I think a big reason it was defeated is that a lot of veterans would be deterred, and others would be deterred from seeing psychologists, because having received psychological care was, under some interpretations, would have been made an inability to have weapons in the cause of self-defense. So these things, having Washington more and more involved, they always have their hidden consequences, and deterring people from seeking psychiatric or psychological help when they need it would have been one of those consequences, I'm afraid.
Mr. Booker.
It's an insult to our veterans and a cop-out on the actual question. Over 90% of New Jersey gun owners, 90% of the people in our state believe that we should have comprehensive background checks to prevent illegal folks from getting their hands on weapons, and yes, to prevent spousal abusers and people who are mentally unstable, the kind that have been causing so much violence in our country. My opponent, who lives in Virginia, actually has the state that actually has the most weapons coming into our streets. We need to stop this flow of illegal weapons, and one of the ways of doing that is comprehensive background checks that the overwhelming majority of New Jerseyans support.
Mr. Booker, a question for you. When your opponent ran against Bill Bradley in 1978, they debated 21 times. This is the only debate that you have agreed to. Why so stingy?
Well, a couple things. One is debates are a good way to get it out, and I'm happy the viewers are tuning in, but it's not the only way. You can run around the state like I have, north to south, east to west, doing town halls, community forums, meeting with business leaders and the like. And that's what we wanted to do, is get directly to the people. My opponent's playing catch up. I'm not sure if many people know that he just moved back into the state like in January or February, and has been now trying to run around the state and pretend like he knows the problems of our communities. And so I'm going to continue having direct contact with the voters to the very last day, because I think that's the best way to get the message out.
Mr. Bell?
You know, I hear a lot of specific questions put to Senator Booker, and the way he usually responds is by saying he has meetings. He has meetings with sympathetic people, with people that he's trying to help. But you still don't know whether he favors a North Jersey casino, because he's had a lot of meetings in South Jersey and listened to all those concerns. And apparently he thinks going to meetings with friendly audiences, and he is a celebrity and people like him, and I don't blame them for liking him, is a substitute for actually debating the issues. I find that really disturbing.
And Mr. Bell, I actually want to get this question in because, again, we are close to the end of this debate. You have lived in Virginia for the past 31 years, and just this past year, you rented a home in Leonia. How can you convince voters that you understand their issues and that you're going to fight for them?
Well, Senator Booker has certainly reminded everyone that I was away for 30 years, and it's not exactly a gotcha point, because I start every speech that I give saying that I've been away for 30 years and that it is presumptuous for me to come back and ask to represent the people of New Jersey after that kind of an absence. And the reason is that I couldn't get anybody in Congress or federal candidates for president and otherwise to take up this disastrous zero interest rate policy of the Federal Reserve and move to a different policy. The wheels have fallen off the system, and the Fed is so powerful, it's running our entire economy, retarding small business growth, retarding job growth, not letting people have returns on their savings, and I couldn't get anyone to do it.
Okay,
it was a last-minute decision,
I'm
and I'm happy.
You got 20 seconds.
I have 20 seconds.
That's it.
I agree with him. It is presumptuous to him to come back just a few months ago and run on a single vanity issue, which is taking America back to the gold standard, something that was debunked in the 1900s as something that would gut jobs and hurt the middle class.
Okay. Okay.
I have to say that
I'm sorry,
a vanity issue is about the stagnation in our economy. I have a solution to it. Your solution is keep doing what we're doing under President Obama.
Okay. Gentlemen, thank you both. We've reached the end of our question and answer segment. Now it's time for the candidates' closing statements.
And the order was determined by a random draw. We begin with Mr. Bell.
I really want to thank the League of Women Voters and the moderators and the reporters. I think it's been a lively discussion. I want to thank Senator Booker for his willingness to debate, even if only this one time. And I also, above all, I want to thank the voters of New Jersey. Yes, I did consider it somewhat presumptuous, but the voters of New Jersey have shown they are open-minded and willing to listen to an idea that is off the charts and make their own decisions about it. Not by taking a head count of economists that Senator Booker has given as his only argument against the gold standard, or saying that it's an old system, but by simply listening to the merits, making arguments for or against it, listening, having a reasoned debate. It happened to me before when I ran on the Kemp-Roth tax cut, and even though I didn't beat Bill Bradley, he and I wound up working together in a bipartisan fashion on the Tax Reform Act of 1986. I'm proud of that record. I'm happy that I came back to the state of New Jersey, and I really am incredibly grateful to the people of New Jersey for hearing me out regardless of what happens on November 4th.
Mr. Booker.
I want to thank the sponsors as well as moderators. There's a very clear choice before the voters in New Jersey, between going back to programs that are broken and haven't worked, or going forward to growth and prosperity. My opponent wants to take us back on women's rights, just restricting access to birth control, taking away a woman to make her own medical decisions, opposing things like equal work for equal pay. He wants to go back and take the federal government out of supporting our local schools and even doing common sense things like making college more affordable. He wants to go back by having the federal government stopping investing in things that we who live in New Jersey know we need investment in, like infrastructure with our roads crumbling and New Jersey Transit being inadequate to meet the demands that there are there now. And yes, he wants to take us back to a 19th century idea that is defunct and debunked universally. I want to take us forward. And I don't want to be a Tea Party person that goes down and rigidly, idealistically doesn't work with folks, but I want to work with Democrats and Republicans together. All of us here in New Jersey, one destiny, to bring ourselves forward as a state. I hope that I get a chance to be your senator for a full term.
Gentlemen, thank you. And that concludes today's debate. We'd like to thank the candidates for appearing today, and we'd like to thank you for watching.
And also thanks to our panelists, Mariela Salgado of WXTV Univision TCS 41, Matt Friedman of the Star-Ledger, and Jonathan Tamari of the Philadelphia Inquirer. I'm Jim Gardner for Action News.
And I'm Sade Better-Noir of WABC TV. Thanks again for watching, and we leave you with these final words from the League of Women Voters of New Jersey.
I'm Toni Zimmer, President of the League of Women Voters of New Jersey. On behalf of the League, I would like to thank you for watching today's debate. By taking time to learn about the issues today, you are helping to preserve and protect our democracy. For more information on voting, please contact us at 800-792-VOTE or visit us online at www.lwvnj.org. Be sure to vote on Tuesday, November 4th. Polls are open from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m.